What's up everyone, I'm Nick, welcome back. This channel is called Swiftful Thinking, where we cover all things Swift and SwiftUI related. And in this probably long-awaited video for some of you, we are finally going to jump in and tackle core data. Now in this video, we're going to look at using the fetch request. And I would say this is kind of like the entry level, the beginner version of using core data in your SwiftUI application. And to start, we're actually going to create a new Xcode project, and we're going to check a little box that Apple gives us that says use core data. And by checking this box, Apple actually provides us with some template data to get started. So what we're going to do is first run through that template data, examine it and try to figure out what exactly it's all doing, and then we're going to customize it so that we can actually use it in our own apps. Now I do want to mention before we get started that in the next video, I'm going to run through pretty much the same process of adding core data into our app, but not using a fetch request and actually using the MVVM architecture, which I've used a bunch of times throughout this course. So this video is showing you one way to use core data, but the next video is also just as important for adding core data into your SwiftUI apps. And I should mention, for those of you who have no idea what core data is, basically it is a database that is stored within the iPhone, and we can use it to save data to it, and this data would persist between sessions. So if a user closes the app and reopens the app, this data will save. If you followed my SwiftUI bootcamp, we did a video on app storage and user defaults, and this kind of works the same way, except core data is much more for adding an entire database, adding a ton of data, rather than user defaults, which should be used for small pieces of data. All right, I hope you're excited. Core data is super useful in production apps. Let's take a look. All right, guys, I am back in Xcode, but for this one specific video, we're actually going to create a new Xcode project. Because when you create an Xcode project, there's an option to add core data into your app. And Apple actually gives us some template logic that we can use to get started with core data pretty quickly. So let's go ahead and create a new project. I'm going to click File, New. We're going to do a project. This will be an app, an iOS app. Go ahead and click Next. Let's call this Core Data Bootcamp. It's okay if you don't have a team here, you can leave that blank or none for now. I'm just using my personal team. Organization identifier should just be com dot and then your organization or your team or your company. It's not very relevant for now because we're not going to put this into the App Store. The interface, make sure it's SwiftUI. The lifecycle is SwiftUI app. The language is Swift. And in this project, we're going to use core data. We're not going to host it in CloudKit, so that can stay unchecked, but make sure use core data is clicked here. And when we click this, Apple's going to give us some of that template code to use core data. Go ahead and click Next. Find where you want to save it in your computer. Go ahead and click Create. All right, and once we're in our project here, let's first click Resume on the canvas to make sure we're all connected. And as you can see, because we clicked core data, there's a whole bunch of this template logic here that Apple has already written and given us. And there's also another file here, which we're going to look in a minute, called persistence, which Apple has given us. So click Resume and make sure we're all connected. It might take a second to load because it's actually loading core data to load into the app right now. All right, and before we get coding, we're going to take a look at some of this template code just to see what Apple has given to us, what some of this logic is actually doing. So at the top here, I'm just going to change my device to iPhone 12 because it looks a little better. So let's start at the beginning of our app here. So we're going to go back into the core data bootcamp app.swift file. And in this file, we can see the app main. So this is where our app is starting. And inside this file, we are creating a persistence controller. And if you follow my last couple videos, we created some singleton classes. And this right here is actually a singleton class. So if we look at the persistence controller.shared, and I right click it and jump to the definition, we can see that static let shared equals persistence controller. So this is a singleton, which we've been using. So you should be used to this by now. Basically, that means that this is one instance that we're going to use across our entire app. I'm going to go back, and it looks like we're getting a reference to this persistence controller right here. And then we're putting this persistence controller into the environment. Now, if you watch some of my other videos, if you are familiar with the environment object, this is kind of the same thing. We're putting this, whatever this is, into the environment so that all of the views that are subviews of this view will have access to whatever we're putting in the environment. And it looks like we're putting in a view context. So before we go to the content view, let's take a look at what this persistence controller actually is. So I'm going to jump to that. I'm going to right click on the shared and jump to definition. I could also just click on the persistence.swift file on the navigator on the left side. And this is a struct called persistence controller. We have a singleton, so a single instance of it. And it looks like this variable here is a static preview of the persistence controller that I'm guessing we're going to be using for the actual preview in our application. Below this, it looks like we have another variable called container. This is of type NSPersistence container. And then we have our init statement, and this is where we actually are initializing a persistence controller. And there's a parameter called inMemory that's set to false by default unless we override it. And it looks like we're first setting up this container by setting container equal to a new NSPersistence container. The name of this container is Core Data Bootcamp. And while we're looking at this, the name Core Data Bootcamp here is the exact same as the name of this other file, coredatabootcamp.xc data model ID. And if you named your project something else, this probably says whatever your project name is, and so does this. So basically, this container is referencing this file here. Then there's a little bit of logic here for if it's in the memory, but we're not actually going to use that, so I'm not going to worry about it. And then there's a container.loadPersistentStores. And this is basically the main function to load the data from the container. So you can think of the container kind of as the database that's holding all of our data. So here we're referencing where that all is stored. And here we're loading all of the content from that container. So there's a little bit of logic here that says if there's an error, cause a fatal error. And fatal error is an automatic crash in your application. And Apple is doing this just in case we go to create this app and for some reason we can't find this persistent container because maybe we spelled this wrong. Well, we're going to crash immediately. So Apple's just letting us know that if you set this up wrong, we're going to cause a fatal error here. And this is great for development purposes, but I will say that if you're putting this into your actual application, I would probably remove any fatal error because I would personally rather have the data not saving than the app actually crashing. Regardless, we're going to keep it in for now because if we're setting up something wrong, let's get it crashed so we know what we're doing wrong. All right, now that we see the persistence controller is basically creating the container, loading the data into the container, we can jump back into the core data app, bootcampapp.swift. So we have our controller, which holds that container. And then in the environment, we're putting in the controller.container.viewContext. And the view context is actually going to be the data that's inside that container. So if we jump into the content view, we then have a very simple screen here. We have a list, and the list is a for each on items. And if we look at the items, it is actually this variable here. So this variable is an @fetchRequest with sort descriptors. This is basically just sorting all of the data in this request. So they're sorting it by timestamp. And then with animation is just default. And this items is of type fetch results and is going to be a bunch of items. So we're taking those items and we're looping through them, and it says item at, and then we get the timestamp, and we can see that right here on the screen. Here's all of our items. And then there's a toolbar, which we can't actually see right now, but if we could see the toolbar and we were in a navigation view, we would see this edit button. And there should be a button to actually add an item as well. So let's put our list into a navigation view just so we can start to see some of this toolbar. So let's add a navigation view. open the brackets, and we're going to put the list inside. So for our purposes, because we're on an iPhone, we're actually not even going to use the toolbar. We're just going to use the navigation bar buttons. So let's just go ahead and write navigation bar button. Navigation bar items, leading and trailing. Let's put these on separate lines. The leading will be the edit button, which we have right here, and then the trailing will be this button. So I'm just going to cut this button and just paste it into the view here. Let's get rid of this toolbar modifier, and we should be able to see both of our buttons on the screen here. Let's take this list and give it a .list style of plain list style, just so we get back to our starting state. And let's add a navigation title of maybe Core Data Bootcamp. All right, very simple screen here. We have all of our items that are just preloaded. These are fake items right now. We have the ability to add an item. If we click this add item, it automatically added one at the bottom. And we can see here that the function is add item. So in the add item, it's doing it with animation. It's creating a new item. And then this is a blank item right now. And then it's going to give that item a timestamp, which is the current date. And then it's going to do this do statement, which basically calls the context, which remember we put into the environment at the beginning. And it's just calling save on that context. And if there's an error saving, it's going to cause a fatal error, and we're going to get a quick little crash. When we have delete items, it's almost the same logic. This line of code is finding that data in the data array and then calling viewContext.delete. And after it's deleting that item, it's just calling save again. So if we swipe to delete on our preview, we can actually delete these items, and they're being saved in real time. So if I were to close this app and reopen this app, the core data would persist and it would save between sessions. And this is all great that Apple has given us this fetch request and the environment preloaded into our app. But of course, this model isn't exactly what we're looking for. Most of the time, we're going to want to make our own models. So let's go ahead and start changing this around to adapt for our template application right now. So what we're going to do, instead of just a list of items, we're going to have a list of fruits. And this will be a list of all the fruits that we want to save in our application. So let's change the title to fruits. Let's get rid of the edit button because we're not even using it right now. All right, so let's first look at the item, see what it is, and then let's create a fruit. So right now, if we go into the core data bootcamp.xc data model file, we can see that we have an entity here, and our entity is called item, and it has a timestamp with a date. So of course, we want to create a new fruit entity instead of just an item. And we're going to create a new entity instead of this item. So let's go ahead and click add entity. This entity we're going to call fruit entity. I like to use the word entity just so that we know this is like a core data entity. And if I click onto the fruit entity, we should see that there is no attributes right now. So we want to actually add some attributes, and all our fruits are going to have is basically a title. So let's click the plus here. Let's add a name for the fruit, and the name is going to be a string. Now, if you had other attributes that you wanted to include in this data model, so if you wanted to have booleans and more names or a subtitle, you would go ahead and add all of these right here. You would put your name and then whatever type you want it to be here. Now, I'll note that you can't save images directly to core data. You could save binary data, so you could convert an image into data. You convert a color into data, but you can't save a color or an image directly into core data. When you're saving core data, most of the time you're going to want to keep your data into the data types that are right here. So doubles, floats, strings, bools, dates, UIDs, etc. But I'm not going to use this one, so let's press the minus sign, and we're just going to have a name that is of type string. While we're here, we can also remove the item. So let's just click on the item and click the delete button on your keyboard. So the core data bootcamp only has a fruit entity right now. Let's go back into the persistence.swift file. Let's take a look at this. And this preview, I forgot to mention, is actually on the content view. When you look at the preview of the content, it's referencing the persistence controller.preview.container.view context. So we're going to go back into that persistence, and when we look at this, the persistence controller, the logic is all fine, but in this statement right here, it's going for 0 to 10. It's creating a new item, and the item it's putting into the context, and then for each of those items, it's going to give it a date. And we just deleted the item from our context, right? So instead of adding an item here, let's add a fruit entity. It's not coming up on my app, so I'm going to click Command-Shift-K to clean and rebuild. Let's try this again, fruit entity, and it is not working on my Xcode project. I've ran into this problem before. Sometimes the indexing just doesn't work when we update that data model. So I'm going to actually just close out and quit Xcode and then reopen this file real quick. All right, so I'm back in the file. It is now finding that fruit entity. I'm going to open the parentheses and go to the context. We're going to add this to the view context, which we found right here. And let's call this new fruit. And then we're just going to call new fruit dot name. And we need to give it a name. And I'm just going to add apple, and then use the / open close parentheses. And let's just give it an ID based on this loop here. So this will be, let's call this X, and let's just put X in here. So our list should say apple 1, apple 2, apple 3, apple 4, etc. The rest of this looks good to me. We'll go down here. In the init, this looks fine. The container name is actually still Core Data Bootcamp because we haven't changed this container here, which is the file on the left. If we created a new XC data model, we would have had to change the name here. And then we're just loading the persistent stores, and this all looks good. So there's actually not much code we had to write here to update this for our new fruit. So going back into Core Data App.Bootcamp, this should all be the same. Let's go back into the content view, and now there's some things that we do need to update. All right, so first we're getting an error on this fetch request that the fetch results, it can't find item in scope, and that's because, of course, we want fruits. I'm going to create a new fetch request from scratch for you guys. So let's go @fetch request, open parentheses, and we're going to look for the very simple one with entity and sort descriptors. And this is first looking for what kind of entity we want to get from this fetch request. So of course we want to get the fruit entity, and we're going to call .entity. So now it knows what we want to get. And then sort descriptors is how we want to sort this data. And right now we're not going to sort it at all, so let's just keep this a blank array here. And let's call this var fruits, and this will be of type, just like right here, fetched results of fruit entity. And let's go ahead and delete this first fetch request because we're not using it anymore. Let's take this fetch request, which is called fruits, put it into our for each. This will be for each fruit. Let's change this text to say text, and let's just give it the fruit dot name. Remember, this should be like apple 1, apple 2, apple 3. Otherwise, with 2 question marks, and we'll just put a blank string. So if the fruit doesn't have a name, we'll just leave a blank string. And then we should be able to actually load this on the canvas, and we can get all of our fruits coming in. And remember, we made the preview fruits just say apple with a number. And let's go ahead and update our add item function here. So like before, when we had the new item, we're going to say let new fruit equals fruit entity. Let's give it the context, which is the view context, which we're pulling in again from the environment. And then we're going to call new fruit dot name, and we're going to set that equal to, let's set this equal to orange. We're going to update this in a second. Let's get rid of some of this old data. And then I noticed that in the add item and the delete items, both of these functions have this same do statement where we save the data. So I'm just going to make that its own function. So let's call private func save items, open close parentheses, open the brackets. Let's take this do statement, let's just cut this, paste it in here, and we're going to call save items. And again up here we'll delete this do statement and we'll call save items. So very simply we create a new fruit, we put it into the context, we update that name, and then we click save. Down here we need to delete the items, and we're going to find the item at this offset. Now this is probably a better approach to do it, but it's a little complicated for beginner developers. So we're just going to do this very simply. We're going to say let index equals offsets dot first. So this offset technically could have a bunch of indexes, but when we swipe to delete, we know that there's only going to be one index that we're worried about. So we're just going to look for the first index in this offset set, and this is optional. So let's say guard let index equals dot first else return. Then we'll say let fruit entity equals fruits, and then we'll access that entity with the index. And then we'll just call view context dot delete, and we're going to pass in our fruit entity. So I'll delete this logic here, and very simply this is going to find our fruit, delete it from the context, and then we need to click save. Alright, let's resume the canvas. And we now have all of our apples. Let's click add item. We get a new orange here, and we can delete these items as well. And if I were to run this on a simulator, on an actual device, I would be able to add items and then delete them, and they would save forever because they're saving in core data. Now there's a couple things I want to do before we wrap up this video. At the top, right now it looks like these are not organized by anything, and that's because we didn't add any sort descriptors. So with this sort descriptors, we can keep our data sorted however we want. So I'm going to put this on separate lines here, and let's even put the var fruits on a separate line, and let's add a descriptor in this array. So if I hold the option button and click on sort descriptors, it is looking for an array of ns sort descriptor. So let's add one, ns sort descriptor, open the parentheses. I'm going to look for the one with a key path and ascending completion. The key path is going to be backslash fruit entity dot name. So we're going to sort by the name, and let's just do ascending is true. So our data should now be always organized by name. And so we have apple 0 at the top, 9 at the bottom, and if I add an item, the item is going to have the word orange, so that should always be at the bottom. So if I add items, they will always go to the bottom. And if we made this false and click to resume, when we add items, they will always be at the top because it is now organized, it's now sorted by name, and it's descending. So that looks awesome. Alright, and now the last thing I want to do before we wrap up this video is actually show you this on a simulator. And I don't like that we're adding the word orange every time. I want to be able to add my own fruits. So in this navigation view, let's add a VStack. Let's give it some spacing of 20. Let's open the brackets. Let's take this list and list style. Let's cut it. Let's paste it inside the VStack. And then above the list, I'm going to add, let's first add a text field. Open the parentheses. Let's use the string protocol and text. The title of the text field will say add fruit here, ... Then we need a binding for this text. So let's do @state var text field text of type string equals a blank string for now. The text, let's bind it with the money sign text field text. And let's try again to see if it pops up on our screen. Okay, below it, let's add a button. Open the parentheses, let's use the action and label. And I'm moving a little faster because we've done this so many times throughout this course. Let's do a little bit of formatting now. So this button, let's give it a font of headline. Let's give it a background color of color. Maybe we'll do a color literal. We haven't done those in a while. Double click that color literal. Let's get a cool color going. I'm gonna open the crayons and maybe we'll use this blue. Looks kind of cool. Well, let's do a darker blue. Cool. Let's give this a foreground color of white, so white text. Let's give this a frame, and I'm doing this before we add the background, so frame of max width of infinity. Let's give it a frame with a width, with a height of 55. Looking better. Let's give it a dot corner radius of 10. And on the button, let's just add some padding of horizontal. Cool. Let's edit the text field quickly. Let's give it a dot background. Let's give it a color literal. Double click the color literal, and I like to use this mercury color for text fields. I think it's a nice off-white. Let's make it the same size. I'm going to copy the frame and the width here, put that before the background. Let's also give it a font of headline. And let's give it a padding of horizontal. Let's also give it a corner radius, after the background. And it's looking pretty good. Let's add a little bit of indentation here before the word add. So before we add the frames, let's just add a dot padding, dot leading. It adds a little bit of padding right in there, and this looks pretty good. And now when we click this button, we want to of course add fruits. So in this button, let's click add item. Let's change this to submit. This is looking pretty good. We are not using this add item on the top right anymore, so let's get rid of that trailing bar items. Cool. And lastly, in our add item function, instead of using the word orange, let's just use the text that's in the text field. So here we'll just put text field text, and then after we use the text field text, we want to reset it. So down here after we click save, let's just call text field text equals blank string. Now in my app here, let's reload it just to make sure we are all connected. And now that we have our app, I think it is ready to actually test on a device. So I'm going to make sure we're on the iPhone 12, and let's run this on an actual simulator and see if it works. Alright, when my app loads now, we have a blank canvas, and that's because when we're loading on the simulator, we're not loading that preview like we've been doing with all those fake apples. Because in the content view, when we're on the canvas, we load that preview container. But now we're loading the actual container in our app, and it doesn't have anything saved yet, which is why it's blank. So let's go ahead and add some fruits. Let's do apple, and it works. Orange, and that works. And remember, we have ascending as false. So I actually want to make it ascending, so let's put that as true. Let's run the simulator one more time. And you'll notice that when we restarted our app, it now saved this data in core data and then pulled it back from core data. So these will save forever, and this is very efficient. If you actually want to put an app into the App Store, this is a great place to save a ton of data. So we can add watermelon. When we add this, the W should be at the end of the list. And if we add another one, maybe banana, you'll see that it goes right in alphabetical order. We can of course also delete items, and if we delete the items, they will persist. So I can totally shut down my app here and then restart it, and it will load the exact same data. Alright, and the very last thing I want to show you guys, which I just realized, is that some of you are going to ask how to update items. So we have adding items, we have deleting items, we are getting items through the fetch request, but we are not updating items anywhere. So let's create a quick little function. Let's put it after the add items. Let's create a private func update item, open close parentheses, open the brackets, And we want to do whatever we're going to do with animation. Let's open the brackets. Basically, the logic is exactly like we have in the delete items, where we first need to get the entity and then we need to call something on it. So here we're getting the entity and then we call delete and then we save it. And when we add item, we are creating an entity, we are adding it to the context, and then we are saving it. And here we are going to get the entity and then save it. So at the bottom here, let's just put save items to make sure we don't forget that. And then we need to get the entity. And when we swipe to delete items, because we're using the swipe to delete, it automatically gives us the offsets, right? That's if we go back up here. This on delete action gives us those offsets. But when we go to update, we're actually just going to add a tap gesture onto the text. So I'm going to use the .on tap gesture. And then from on tap gesture, we're just going to call update item. And we're going to pass in the fruit that we're tapping on. So this fruit is an entity already. So when we call delete items, we needed to take the offset and then find the entity from the offset. But since we're already tapping on it, we already have the entity. So I'm going to add fruit of type fruit entity. In the tap gesture, we'll call update item. And we'll just pass in the fruit directly. So we already have the entity. And then we can just update the entity directly. So we'll say let current name equals fruit.name. And this is optional. So we'll just say 2 question marks and then we'll give it a blank string. So if there's no name, which we know there is a name, but if there's no name, it would be a blank string. Then we'll say let new name equals the current name plus an exclamation point. And then we'll just say fruit.name and we'll set it equal to the new name. So when we want to update an item, all we need to do is get the entity itself, update one of the variables in the entity, and then save it back down. So it's really that simple. And if I rerun the app one more time, if I click on the orange, it should now update the entity and we are saving. And this should persist. So if I close down the app and reopened it, because it's in core data, it will save. Now, of course, in your actual app, you're probably not going to just add an exclamation point. You're going to add some UI to actually update the items, maybe change the title, maybe change a number of how many oranges or watermelons you want. But the basic logic for updating is exactly this: get the entity, update a variable, and hit save. So to run through this one final time, to add an item, all we need to do is create an entity, put it in the context, and this will be a blank entity, so we just need to update all the variables with the data, and then click save. When we update, we just need to get the entity, and then update whatever variables we want, and then click save. And when we delete, we just need to find the entity and then delete it from the context and then click save. And our save is very simple. It's just a do view context.save. All right, guys, I hope you're feeling a little more comfortable with core data. We now have the ability to add items. We have the ability to delete items. We can update items. And we're doing it all with this handy fetch request. And just to remind you, the reason we can do this fetch request at all is because in the app.swift file, we are getting the core data view context, which we are then putting into the environment. And then we're pulling the view context from the environment so that we can use it. And we can perform the fetch request, which then gets our fruit entities. And then at the bottom, we have all of our functions to add, update, delete, and save. Now this is great, of course, and it's a great starting point if you've never used core data before. This fetch request makes getting that data into your view very fast and very easy. So it's great for beginners, but if you followed my courses, if you're familiar with MVVM architecture, you're probably well aware that a lot of the time when you're making apps, you want to separate the logic in your apps so that each file or each layer has a specific purpose. And right now in our view, as you can see, we have a lot of logic because we have the logic for the data coming in this fetch request. Then we have the logic for the actual UI in the view here. And then we have more functions for the actual data. So in MVVM architecture, we would actually extract all of these functions here, and we would take even the fetch request and we would go and put it in another file so that the logic that remains in the view is specifically related to the view, which would be the actual UI components, and the logic in the class or the view model is specific to the data source, and that's where we would do all of our data updating, downloading, appending, etc. If that's something you're interested in, I highly recommend you to stick around for the next video, because in the next video we're going to do essentially the same thing that we just did here, but instead of using the fetch request, we are going to implement core data with MVVM architecture, because I do believe that that is a little more realistic for production applications. Alright guys, that was a lot of me talking. I hope you followed that, and I hope you're excited for the next video. As always, I'm Nick, this is Swiftful Thinking, and I'll see you in the next video.